Something gets really quiet, so I should listen. Oh, yeah.
I know. We're here. That's just what you just had written. I don't.
It just got quiet. Shall I? Do I need this?
I don't.
I think maybe we should. I think I'll do that because.
All right. Hello, everyone.
I mean, no, but you can. I'm welcome to use it.
Can everyone hear me?
Sure.
Okay, great. I'm Dale Peck. I'm the editor-in-chief of Evergreen Review. I want to thank you for coming out to our event on translation. In a moment, I'm going to introduce G, who's going to introduce our panelists. I just want to say a little bit about the magazine before we get started. For those of you who don't know, the Evergreen Review was founded in 1957 by the great Barney Rossett, also the founder of Grove Press. It was sort of instrumental in bringing a certain kind of European modernist writing to America, as well as various international writings. I think Evergreen gave Soyinka, Mishima, Kuroda, some of their first U.S. publications, and all that, more Nobel Prize winners than you could shake a stick at. The lovely John Oakes sitting over here is our current publisher. He is Barney's executor, or just the executor of this part of the estate. At any rate, Barney handpicked John, to carry on the legacy, and we relaunched the magazine 2017, I think, on a shoestring budget. And I'm very proud to say that 6 years later, we are still going strong. We're publishing close to about 200 pieces a year now, I think. Evergreenreview.com is where you can find us. I want to thank our various editors, and help me if I forget anyone. Justin, aka Miracle Jones, is back there, and Ji Liang-ko is our poetry editor. Bonnie Chau as well. What is your official title, Bonnie? Assistant editor. And John, of course. Evergreen is free of charge to read. You are all welcome to submit if you want to through Submittable. We charge a modest fee, or if you feel like you can afford it, you can waive that option there. We also are a small nonprofit, and if you want to make a donation, there are little cards floating around that will tell you where to go. But if you go to evergreenreview.com, that will tell you how to do it. And then I think we have we're working on 2 events, but they're not the Sin with Evergreen event coming up. We're going to do a little event on pornography, because Evergreen has a storied history with pornography for some reason, with one of our board members, Paul Chan. Then we're working on a tribute to the late great writer, Bo Houston. If you knew him, he was a gay writer from the 1980s, 1990s, who died of AIDS and stuff. And I will briefly be professional and call your attention to a few things in the magazine right now. I mean, you can't really resist the first piece. Pop-ins and floggings inside the senior porn revolution by Nancy Jane Schill. That's our lead story right now. New poems by Cynthia Abdallah. An essay by Lynn Horton. A story by Abdul Rahim Husani. An artist conversation between Chris Postan and Karen Chifano. Another story, Okeki, art by Lionel Pruitt. And other pieces as well. I would point you to, and I guess the one thing, no, I'm not going to say that. I'm just going to leave it and turn it over to G. And thank you all for the event, for coming to the event.
Thanks so much, Dale. Hi everyone, my name is Ji Liang-ko. I am the poetry editor of the Evergreen Review. Very fortunate to be so. And also I am the founder and the organizer of Singapore Unbound, which is a New York City-based literary nonprofit. What does Singapore Unbound do? We actually organize events such as this one, as well as a literary festival in New York City once every 2 years. So if you actually take a look at this is actually the festival program for last year's festival. And the theme of the festival was Archipelago Dreaming. So for that festival, we brought together writers from Southeast Asia and from the Caribbean, 2 very different archipelagos, to actually talk to one another about their work. Besides organizing events, we also publish. We publish books through our indie press called Gaudy Boy. And we also publish original poetry, fiction, and essays on our online journal called Suspect. So if you identify as Asian, please check us out and submit things to us. Even if you don't identify as Asian, I think you will find yourself really enjoying the work that we actually publish. But to this afternoon's event, we're so pleased to actually have these wonderful translators actually going to be speaking to us about their work this afternoon. I teach together with Emma in the same school at the Brearley School. I was so delighted when she actually joined the school this year, and she introduced me to Marguerite Duras, whom I must confess I did not read before this, and I'm completely hooked. And I think she will hook us on to that writer's work or other French translations that she will be reading for us this afternoon. And then for Lisa Hofmann-Kuroda, I have a special place in my heart for Japanese literature. So I'm very, very excited to hear what Lisa will be sharing from the Japanese. And then of course, Natasha Wimmer, I have read the two big books by Roberto Bolaño, as most of us have, Savage Detectives as well as 2066. And we're kind of blown away by the fictional inventiveness of it all. And so to discover, that a translator is here, this afternoon is such a wonderful treat to hear from her about her translation of Roberto Bolaño and other Spanish language writers. I'm actually going to turn this time over to our assistant editor, the assistant editor of the Evergreen Review, Bonnie Chau, who is actually going to be introducing these wonderful panelists in greater detail. Bonnie is a teacher, a writer, and a translator herself, and we're so glad that she's going to be moderating this afternoon's panel. Bonnie.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thanks G and Singapore Unbound for co-hosting. I'm super excited to have this afternoon of translation. So I'm just going to briefly introduce each of the translators before they read from one of their favorite translations. And then we'll have a kind of Q&A conversation afterwards. And we'll be opening up questions to the audience. So as they're reading and as we're talking, please feel free to kind of mentally gather any questions that you might have. Okay, so we're going to start with Lisa. And I'm reading this bio from your website. I hope you don't mind. Lisa Hofmann-Kuroda is a Japanese to English literary translator based in New York City. Born in Tokyo and raised in Texas, she received her BA from Wesleyan and her PhD from UC Berkeley. From 2018 to 2019, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies at Harvard. She has taught workshops and classes at Catapult, the Japanese Culture and Community Center of Northern California, and the Bard Micro College Program. She is an active member of the Alta BIPOC Translators Caucus, which is an amazing translators caucus, and a two-time graduate of the British Center for Literary Translation Summer School, and has translated or is currently translating work by, I took like Japanese 1 in college, so we'll see how this goes. Ryunosuke Akutagawa, Minako Oba, Toshiko Tamura, Yuko Tsushima, Yoko Tawada, Shun Meduruma, and Natsu Kirino. Her work is forthcoming from New Directions, Knopf, Strangers Press, and Farrar, Straus, and Cheever.
Thank you. Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming. Can you hear me through my mask, okay?
Yes.
Cool. Awesome, so I'm gonna be reading a little bit of kappa. This is actually my first publication, and I'm really excited. It'll be out in June. It's a co-translation with my friend and colleague Allison Markin-Powell, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but she's a seasoned veteran translator of Japanese literature, so it was a real honor to get to work on this with her. This is actually also a retranslation of a novella that's been translated, I think 3 times in the past. The last one maybe came out in the 70s, so it was really cool. It was a cool process to try and kind of update the language a little bit for the 21st century. Akutagawa, I'll just do a really brief introduction. I think maybe in the popular consciousness, at least in the US, he's known for his short stories. He was a Japanese modernist writer in the 20s and 30s. He wrote a very famous short story called In a Grove that then got adapted by Akira Kurosawa. The film was called Rashomon. And I think in Kappa you can see some similar themes. I guess one in the setting, if you remember in Rashomon, the kind of dark woods, the murky dark woods in the beginning. Also the emphasis on the instability of knowledge and inability to find the actual truth of things. Okay, so I guess I'll read a couple lines from the Japanese and then I'll dive in. Okay, Kappa. これはある精神病院の患者第23号が誰にでもしゃべる話である。彼はもう30を越しているであろう。が、一見したところはいかにも若々しい狂人である。彼の反省の経験は、いや、そんなことはどうでもよい。彼はただじっと両膝を抱え、時々窓の外へ目をやりながら、鉄格子をはめた窓の外には、枯れ葉さえ見えない樫の木が一本、雪曇りの空に枝を張っていた。Prologue. This is a story told by a certain psychiatric patient, patient number 23 to be exact. It is a story he tells to anyone who will listen. I presume he's at least 30, though at first glance he appears quite the youthful-looking madman. He's spent half his life... No, never mind, that's not important. He relayed the following long-winded story to me and the hospital director, Dr. S., while sitting stock still, his knees locked in his arms, and only darting his eyes toward the window now and again. Beyond the barred window, a single blue oak tree stretched its bare branches against the wintry sky. However, that's not to say that he made no gestures at all. Indeed, as he talked on and on, he became somewhat animated. For example, whenever he expressed surprise, he'd suddenly throw his head back. I've made every attempt to copy down his story here just as he told it to me. If, however, the reader is dissatisfied with my notes, I suggest they go and pay a visit to the S psychiatric ward themselves, which they will find in XX Village just outside of Tokyo. No doubt, they will be greeted there by the childlike patient number 23, who will bow his head politely as he gestures toward a hard, cushionless chair. Then, with a melancholy smile, he will repeat the following story, at the end of which, oh yes, I remember vividly the expression on his face as he's finished speaking. He will leap to his feet and immediately begin shaking his fists in the air, yelling at his listener, Get out! Get out, you son of a bitch! You're just another stupid, jealous, obscene, shameless, conceited, cruel, selfish animal! Get out, you son of a bitch! Chapter 1. It happened one summer a few years ago. I had set out with a knapsack, as one does, intending to climb Mount Hotaka from that hot spring inn at Kamikochi. As you know, there is only one way up Mount Hotaka, which involves following the Azusa River upstream. I climbed Mount Hotaka before, of course, not to mention Mount Yari, so as the morning fog descended upon the Azusa Valley, I decided to go up without a guide. But that valley in the morning mist, I couldn't get a clear view. The fog refused to lift. In fact, it kept getting heavier and heavier. After walking for about an hour, I considered turning back to the inn. But even if I headed back to Kamikochi, I'd still need to wait for the fog to lift. Meanwhile, it was only growing thicker by the minute. Better to keep climbing, I thought, parting the leaves of the low bamboo grass as I went, so as not to stray too far from the river valley. For a long time, all I could see was that dense fog surrounding me, although once in a while the lush green leaves of a beech tree suspended from thick branches, or the needles of a fir would emerge from out of the mist, or sometimes the face of an ox or a horse would suddenly loom close, but then they disappeared into the fog again just as suddenly as they'd appeared. Eventually my feet grew tired and I began to feel hungry. To make matters worse, my hiking clothes and blanket were soaked through from the moisture in the air, making them extraordinarily heavy. At last I gave up and began to make my way back down the river valley, following the sound of running water. I sat down on a rock near the river's edge and turned my attention toward food for the time being. I got myself situated, opened a can of corned beef, gathered kindling to make a fire, and before I knew it, 10 minutes had passed. Meanwhile, that fickle fog had ever so slightly begun to clear. As I took a bite of bread, I glanced at my watch. It was already 1:20, but what shocked me even more than the time was the reflection of a hideous face that appeared for just an instant on my round watch crystal. Startled, I whirled around to look behind me and saw a kappa perched on the rock behind me, just as it looked in pictures. This is what it looks like. The fact is, I'd never seen one of these creatures in real life. It gazed down at me with a look of curiosity, clutching the trunk of a white birch tree with one hand, shading its eyes with the other. For a moment I was so shocked I couldn't move. The kappa, too, seemed quite taken aback. Even the hand above its eyes did not budge. Eventually I sprang to my feet, leaping toward the kappa, but in the same instant it took off running, or at least I think it did, for no sooner had I glimpsed it dodging swiftly away than it disappeared again. More and more flabbergasted, I began searching through the bamboo grass, and suddenly, there it was, 10 feet ahead, had turned back to look at me, poised to flee again. That in and of itself wasn't particularly strange. Rather, what struck me as odd was the kappa's coloring. At first, standing on that rock and peering down at me, it had been a decidedly gray color, but now it had gone completely green from head to toe. Bastard, I yelled, lunging again toward the kappa. It got away, of course. I must have spent the next half an hour desperately chasing after it, rooting around in the bamboo grass, leaping over rocks. The kappa was light on its feet, quick as a monkey. I kept losing sight of it as I gave chase frantically, even slipping and falling a few times. But soon I arrived at the foot of a large horse chestnut tree, where luckily a grazing ox blocked the kappa's way. The ox had thick horns and bloodshot eyes, and the kappa, upon seeing the animal, let out a terrified shriek and somersaulted into a patch of grass. Now I've got him, I muttered to myself as I plunged in after it, close on its heels. But just then, a gaping hole I hadn't noticed before opened up beneath me. The instant my fingers touched the kappa's slippery back, I tumbled headfirst into deep darkness. As I was falling, I suddenly remembered there'd been a kappa bridge near the old Kamikochi Inn. The human mind comes up with the most preposterous things in life or death situations. And then, what happened after that, I can't remember, except for a brilliant light that flashed before my eyes. And before I knew it, I'd lost consciousness. So the rest of the story, basically, it's a very sort of episodic series of stories, but it follows this person, this madman's experiences in Kappa land, the country of the Kappas. Kappas are a creature from Japanese folklore that I guess Akutagawa decided to create this novel around. In Kappa land, basically, like, all of Japanese mores are kind of turned on their head, and he sort of tries to make his way through. At the end, it's sort of unclear whether he's made it all up or not. Hopefully you can enjoy it when it comes out in June. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I asked for a copy of the book and I just got it on Friday, so I'm super excited to read it. Okay. Emma Ramadan is an educator and literary translator from French. She is the recipient of the Penn Translation Prize, the Albertine Prize, 2 NEA fellowships, and a Fulbright. Her translations include Abdallah Tayya's A Country for Dying, Kamal Dawood's Zabor or the Psalms, Barbara Molinard's Panics, and Marguerite Duras' The Easy Life. She's translated over 25 books, including poetry by Ahmed Bouadnani, fiction by Virginie Despentes, and multiple books by Anne F. Carreta.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Sorry, G, I'm not going to read from Duras. I hope that's okay.
That's all right.
Forgive me. I wanted to read from a book that I translated a few years ago, actually, that I've never had a chance to read from in public. So I'm going to read from Zabor or the Psalms by Kamal Dawood, who's an Algerian writer who you may have read The Meursault investigation, which was sort of a rewrite of The Stranger by Albert Camus. And this was another one of his novels that is about a young boy who lives in a village in an unnamed Arab country or North African country, and he essentially discovers that he has a gift where if he writes about somebody in his village who is dying, that his writing prolongs their life and saves their life. And whether or not this is a real gift or something in his imagination is unclear, but there's sort of this magic around when he realizes that he can speak and inhabit multiple languages, specifically French. He feels this kind of power to know himself and to know the world, and that power kind of in his head gets translated into a gift. to save lives. So I'm going to kind of skip around the first section. Writing is the only effective ruse against death. People have tried prayer, medicine, magic, reciting verses on a loop, inactivity, but I think I'm the only one to have found the solution: writing. But that means always writing, non-stop, with hardly any time to eat or relieve myself, to chew fully or scratch my aunt's back while very loosely translating the dialogue of foreign films that rekindle the memories of lives she's never lived. Poor woman, she deserves a book of her own that would let her live to be 100. Strictly speaking, I should never again look up from the page, but stay here, hunched and hard at work, focused on my profound motivations like a martyr, scribbling like an epileptic and moaning about the unruliness of words and their tendency to multiply. A question of life and death, of many deaths, to tell the truth, and of all of life. All, young and old, bound to the speed of my writing, to the screeching of my calligraphy on the page, and to that vital precision I refine by touching on just the right word, the nuance that will save them from the abyss, or the synonym that can postpone the end of the world, a form of madness. The many notebooks I must cover in ink, blank pages 120 or more, preferably unlined, with a cover rigid as rock, but nimble and with an oily, warm texture so as not to irritate the side of my palm. I bought so many notebooks, calculating how many to buy based on the number of people I knew or had heard about who were already dying from disease, old age, or an accident. 2 a day, sometimes 10 or more. One time I bought 78 notebooks at once after attending a neighbor's opulent wedding, sitting alone on the ground with a horrible plate of meat that I left untouched, indifferent to the wailing music, my body noiseless, ignored by everyone except the groom, who wore a ridiculous suit and came by to quickly shake my hand, and staring unabashedly at the many people I had become responsible for, the secret guardian of their longevity. For I was the rower and they the passengers, oh my lord. The nearest bookstore, what they call where I'm from, those places that sell cigarettes, envelopes, stamps, notebooks, and newspapers, knew me and never questioned my purchases. In the village of Abukir, they called me the butcher's son, the one who never stopped reading, and they knew I'd been scrawling in notebooks like someone possessed since I was a child. My father's wealth had to have a consequence, and it was me, with my long, hunched body, my eyes like lakes, and my ridiculous voice, as though destiny were mocking my father's fortune. The kindest in the village sent me old books found in warehouses, the worn yellow pages dating back to the time of the colonizers, torn up magazines, user's manuals for machines that no longer exist or perhaps never did, and most importantly, those enthralling novels with no author and no beginning, because both had been ripped out, bindings maimed, stories skewed with incoherence, orphans I always collect. This chaos was the cornerstone of my universe, and the rest was recorded in notebooks. I was silent and brilliant in school in the early years. I had neat, meticulous handwriting that served as the veins under the skin of appearance. It certainly helped to circulate a kind of blood. The truth is that they hoped to do me a favor by anticipating my needs, especially when the rumor of my gift spread covertly. Some, of course, mocked me discreetly and pitied my family for the implausible defect in our tribe's tree. I was a knot in the wood. In truth, they didn't know whether to ignore me or celebrate me. I wrote in a foreign language that healed the dying and preserved the prestige of the former colonizers. Doctors used it for their prescriptions, but so did the men in power, the new masters of the country, and the immortal films. Could it be sacred, descended from on high? No one had an answer. They shook their heads as if faced with an old marble idol, or as when they passed near the French cemetery to the east. The village was not big, and its conversations were rarely secret. I liked that label, the one who was reading or the one who read. It's a definitive formula, getting at the essential, which is to say the holy book or knowledge. They said it with gravity, contrition, they respected the power. In our country, reading was conflated with domination, not the deciphering of the world. It meant at once knowledge, law, and possession. The first word of the holy book is read, but no one asks about the last word, the devil's exhausted voice whispered to me. One day I had to decipher that enigma, the last word of God, the one he had chosen to initiate his spectacular indifference. The exegesis never mentioned it. We were always hung up on the last judgment, not on the final word. I also wondered why the injunction was made to the reader and not to the writer, why the first word of the angel wasn't right. It was a mystery. What is there to read when the book has not yet been written? Are we meant to read a book that's already before our eyes? Which one? I'm getting sidetracked. So I bought the notebooks as I counted again, eyes closed, body calm, under the gnarled vine of our courtyard at the hour of the siesta, all the people I had met the day before in our village, which I mapped like an island, one by one, meticulously like coins, arranging them on the shelves in my head with numbers and letters and features and names in their tribe, without letting myself get distracted by the clouds or by the season's gentle heat that was transforming the blood under my skin to sugar, or by the few planes that emphasized the silence of the sky. I liked this exercise, preceded by stretching, lengthening both my body and the entire firmament with my arms. I'm going to skip a little. Let's see. Okay. When I forget, death remembers. Confusedly but abruptly, I can't explain it, but I feel bound to the reaper. Its memory and my own are connected like two vases. When one empties, the other fills. Well, that's not quite right. Rather, when my memory empties or wavers, death proves firm, recovers its sight like a raptor. It nosedives and depopulates the village before my eyes, a matter of equilibrium, but also perhaps the enactment of a law I have not fully deciphered. Similarly, when I remember lucidly and use the right words, death is blinded once more and turns back around in the sky, grows distant. Then it kills an animal in the village, attacks a tree to the bone, or gathers insects in the surrounding fields to the east to munch on while it waits to regain its sight. I love describing death thus disoriented, confirming both my gift and its usefulness. It's not about magic in the ancient sense of the term, but the discovery of a law, a sort of revived correspondence. Writing was invented to stabilize memory. That's the premise of my gift. We don't want to forget because we don't want to die or see others around us die. Writing came into the world so universally because it was a powerful way to counter death, and not just an accounting tool in Mesopotamia. Writing is the original rebellion, the real fire stolen, enshrouded in ink to keep us from burning ourselves. What happens when I sleep? Perhaps God keeps watch as a referee in this game. I'll stop there.
Natasha Wimmer is a translator of contemporary fiction and literary nonfiction from Spanish to English. She spent 4 formative years in Spain as a child and concentrated in Romance languages and literature as an undergraduate at Harvard University. She is a regular visiting lecturer at Princeton University and Columbia University and has written reviews and criticism for The Believer, The New York Times, and The Nation, among other publications. She is the recipient of an NEA translation grant, a Penn Translation Award, an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She is the translator of 10 books by Roberto Bolaño, including The Savage Detectives and 2666, and her recent translations include The Twilight Zone by Nona Fernandez and Sudden Death by Alvaro Enrique. She lives in Brooklyn, New York with her husband and 2 children.
Thank you so much. I should have updated the end of that a little bit to say that the most recent book by Nona Fernandez that I've translated is Voyager, which is out this month. But today I'm going to read from a book that I haven't read from for 20 years. And if you read this book when it came out, maybe that will make you feel old. The Savage Detectives. Which is the first Bolaño novel that I translated, and possibly my favorite. And probably most of you know the plot of The Savage Detectives, but just to give you a little context for the part that I'm reading, which is essentially right in the middle of the book. It's about 2 poets, Arturo Belano and Ulises Lima. And at the end of the first part of the book, they disappear. And the middle section of the book is told in the voices of many different characters who encounter them at one point or another. And this section is in the voice of Norman Boltzmann, who runs into Ulises Lima in Tel Aviv. And this is one of my favorite sections of the book. So I'll just also read a little bit from the Spanish and then go on to the English. And I apologize for my voice, I have a cold, I don't always sound quite so hoarse. Norman Boltzmann, sentado en un banco del Parque Edith Wolfson, Tel Aviv, octubre de 1979. Siempre he sido sensible al dolor ajeno. Siempre he intentado solidarizarme con el dolor de los demás. Soy judío mexicano, y conozco la historia de mis dos pueblos. Norman Boltzmann, sitting on a bench in Edith Wolfson Park, Tel Aviv, October 1979. I've always been sensitive to the pain of others, always tried to feel a part of everyone else's suffering. I'm Jewish, a Mexican Jew, and I know the history of my two peoples. That says it all. I'm not trying to justify myself. I'm just trying to tell a story. Maybe I'm also trying to understand its hidden workings I wasn't aware of at the time, but that weigh on me now. Still, my story won't be as coherent as I'd like, and my role in it will flicker like a speck of dust between the light and the dark, between laughter and tears, exactly like a Mexican soap opera or a Yiddish melodrama. Everything began last February. It was a gray afternoon, fine as a shroud, the kind that brings a shudder to the skies of Tel Aviv. Someone rang the bell of our apartment on Hashomer Street. When I opened the door, the poet Ulises Lima, leader of the self-proclaimed visceral realists, was standing there before me. I can't say I knew him. In fact, I'd only met him once. But Claudia used to tell me stories about him, and Danielle read me one of his poems once. Literature isn't my specialty. It may be that I was never able to appreciate the quality of his work. In any case, the man in front of me looked less like a poet than a bum. We didn't get off to a good start, I admit. Claudia and Danielle were at the university, and I had to study. So I let him in, made him a cup of tea, and then went into my room and shut the door. For a minute, everything seemed back to normal. I immersed myself in the philosophers of the Marburg School, Natorp, Cohen, Cassavert, Longa, and in some commentaries on Solomon Maimon, indirectly devastating to the Marburg philosophers. But after a while, it might have been 20 minutes or 2 hours, my mind went blank, and in the middle of that whiteness, the face of Ulises Lima, the recent arrival, began to take shape. And even though in my mind everything was white, it took me a long time, I don't know how long, to make out his features precisely, as if Ulises' face were getting darker instead of brightening in the light. When I came out, he was sprawled in an armchair, asleep. I stood there watching him for a while. Then I went back into my room and tried to concentrate on my work. I couldn't. I should have gone out, but it seemed wrong to leave him alone. I thought about waking him up. I thought that maybe I should follow his example and go to sleep too, but I was too afraid or too embarrassed. I can't say which. At last I took a book from the shelf, Natorp's Religion at the Limits of Humanity, and sat facing him on the sofa. It was around 10 when Claudia and Danielle came in. I had cramps in both legs, and my whole body ached. Worse, nothing I'd read had made any sense, but when I saw them come in the door, I somehow managed to raise my finger to my lips. Why, I don't know. Maybe because I didn't want Ulises to wake up before Claudia and I could talk. Maybe because I'd grown used to hearing the steady rhythm of his breath while he was sleeping. But when Claudia, after a few seconds of hesitation, saw Ulises in the armchair, it was all for nothing. The first thing she said was carajo, or bolas, or cámara, or chale, because even though Claudia was born in Argentina and came to Mexico when she was 16, deep down she's always felt Mexican. Or so she says. Who knows? And Ulises woke up with a start, and the first thing he saw was Claudia smiling at him from less than a foot away, and then he saw Danielle, and Danielle was smiling too. What a surprise. That night we went out to dinner in his honor. At first I said that I really couldn't go, that I had to finish with my Marburg school, but Claudia wouldn't let me get out of it. Don't even think about it, Norman. Let's not start. Dinner was fun, despite my fears. Ulises told us about his adventures, and we all laughed. Or rather, he told Claudia about his adventures, but in such a charming way, in spite of how sad everything he was telling us really was, that we all laughed, which is the best you can do at times like that. Then we went walking home along our Lozorov, taking deep breaths of fresh air. Danielle and I were ahead, quite a long way ahead, and Claudia and Ulises were behind, talking as if they were in Mexico City again and they had all the time in the world. And when Danielle told me not to walk so fast, asking why I was in such a hurry, I quickly changed the subject, asking him what he'd been doing, telling him the first thing that came to mind about crazy old Solomon Maimon, anything to put off what was coming, the moment I was afraid of. I would happily have run away that night. I wish I had. When we got to the apartment, we still had time for a cup of tea. Then Danielle looked at the three of us and said he was going to bed. When I heard his door close, I said the same thing and went into my room. Lying on my bed with the light off, I heard Claudia talking to Ulises for a while. Then the door opened, and Claudia turned on the light, asked me whether I had class the next day, and started to undress. I asked her where Ulises Lima was. Sleeping on the sofa, she said. I asked her what she'd told him. I didn't tell him anything, she answered. Then I undressed too, got in bed, and squeezed my eyes shut. Just to clarify, Ulises Lima is in love with Claudia. For 2 weeks, a new order reigned in our house, or at least that was how it seemed to me, deeply disturbed as I was by small details that perhaps I hadn't noticed before. Claudia, who for the next few days tried to ignore the new situation, finally came to terms with reality too, and said that she was beginning to feel suffocated. On the morning of the second day he was with us, while Claudia was brushing her teeth, Ulises told her that he loved her. Claudia's answer was that she already knew. I came here because of you, Ulises said. I came because I love you. Claudia's answer was that he could have written her a letter. Ulises found that highly encouraging, and he wrote a poem that he read to Claudia at lunch. When I got up discreetly from the table, not wanting to hear it, Claudia asked me to stay, and Danielle seconded the request. The poem was essentially a collection of fragments about a Mediterranean city, Tel Aviv, I guess, and a bum or a mendicant poet. I thought it was beautiful, and I told him so. Danielle agreed. Claudia was quiet for a few minutes, with a thoughtful expression on her face, and then she said that we were right. She wished she could write such beautiful poems. For a minute, I thought everything would work out, that we were all going to be able to get along, and I volunteered to go buy a bottle of wine. But Claudia said that the next day she had to be at the university first thing, and 10 minutes later she had shut herself in our room. Ulises, Danielle, and I talked for a while and had another cup of tea. Then each of us went to his room. Around 3, I got up to go to the bathroom, and as I tiptoed through the living room, I heard Ulises crying. I don't think he realized I was there. He was lying face down, I guess. From where I was, he was just a shape on the sofa, a shape covered with a blanket and an old coat, a heap, a lump of flesh, a shadowy figure heaving, pathetic. I didn't tell Claudia. In fact, it was around then that I first began to hide things from her, keep parts of the story from her, lie to her. As far as our daily lives as students were concerned, things didn't change at all for her, or if they did, she did her best not to let it show. When Ulises first came to Tel Aviv, Danielle was his constant companion, but after 2 or 3 weeks, Danielle had to buckle down again too, or risk jeopardizing his exams. Little by little, I became the only one still available to Ulises, but I was busy with Neo-Kantianism, the Marburg school, Solomon Maimon, and my head was a mess, because each night, when I got up to pee, I'd find Ulises crying in the dark, and that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was that some nights, I thought, today I'll see him cry, see his face, I mean, because until then I'd only heard him, and who could be sure that what I was hearing was crying, and not, for example, the heavy breathing of someone in the middle of jerking off. And when I thought about seeing his face, I imagined it raised in the dark, a face bathed in tears, a face touched by the light of the moon filtering through the living room windows. And that face was so desolate that from the very moment I sat up in bed in the dark, listening to Claudia's raspy breathing beside me, a weight like a rock settled on my heart, and I felt like crying too. And sometimes I spent a long time sitting there in bed, repressing my urge to go to the bathroom, repressing my urge to cry, all for fear that it would happen that night, that he would lift his face in the dark and I would see it.
Thanks to all our translators. I think that, can everyone hear me? No. Okay. Can everyone hear me now? So I think to start off our conversation, I was hoping each of you would share kind of your beginnings, origin story, how you got into translation in the first place. Maybe start with you.
Hi. Yeah, so I started translating when I was in college because I was studying literature and French and writing essays and reading books, and it all just felt like not enough, not tangible, not useful. I don't know. And I wanted to translate my love of, pun not intended, but there it is. I wanted to translate my love of literature and French into something that seemed like it mattered in some way. And so I found out there was a translation track at my university. I started taking classes in linguistics and translation, and then found this book that I was really excited to translate, and just immediately kind of went into a master's in translation so that I could keep kind of learning about translation with other students, and yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm actually pretty new to translation compared to Emma and Natasha, so it's a real honor to be here. In a way, I feel like I've been translating my whole life because I grew up in a bilingual household. I studied literature in college. I kept studying literature in grad school, but it wasn't until a few years ago that it occurred to me that I could translate things. I was working on a project with a few other translators, and I happened to meet my friend Allison Markin-Powell, who's has been doing Japanese literary translation for a long time, and we got to be friends and we got to talking, and this project, Kappa, came up as something we could work on together, and then I sort of fell into it and kept at it. I then also fell into a group that you mentioned, Bonnie, the Alta BIPOC Translators Caucus. It's sort of just like an informal group online of BIPOC translators, and that was just like a really welcoming space where people were very friendly and offered to share resources and tips, and there's no real like template or blueprint for how to become a translator, so it was really nice just to like share space with people and ask questions about how to get started in it. And but this is my first book, so I still have a lot to learn.
So I was working at Ferris, Strauss & Giroux in my 20s in New York, and was helping to commission translations and working on translations under Jonathan Galassi, who was the editor-in-chief at the time. And a Cuban novel came across the desk. Pedro Juan Gutierrez, Dirty Havana Trilogy, and we were having a hard time finding someone who was satisfactory to Jonathan, and so I said, well, maybe I could try a sample, and that was how I got started, essentially with no education at all in translation except for my education as an editor, which I think was helpful.
I wonder how, I guess, Emma, you mentioned that you came across a book you loved, and Lisa, you talked about how the Kappa book came up, but how do you, aside from kind of having a love of the book, or maybe more specifically, how do you decide who to translate? And I know this might be different for different projects, and then my follow-up to that is, and who do you translate for? Which I know is also maybe different for different projects.
In terms of how I choose the books that I translate, it's gonna sound crazy, but it's really like instinct, like a gut feeling. When I'm reading something or walking through a bookstore, I mean, sometimes I'll buy something I'll be walking through a French bookstore and I'll sort of see the same book a few times, and I just get this feeling of, oh, I'm supposed to buy this book, and I shouldn't even be saying, I don't know, this sounds so bizarre, but I'll buy the book and just know before I've even read it that I'm going to translate it, and I should stop. It's just getting worse and worse as I go. But it really is like with Sphinx by Marguerite, which is my first book that I translated exactly 10 years ago, my first published translation, and to date my most successful translation. Before I had actually read the whole book in full, I just knew that I needed to translate it, and it was going to be really important to me. Sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes I am asked to translate a book by a publisher. This book was actually something that I was approached to translate by Other Press, and what a wonderful thing that it's turned out to be one of my favorite books I've ever read. So sometimes it's not just a woo-woo gut instinct moment, but often it is. I will sort of Panics, my translation that came out in September by Barbara Molinard, had been out of print for many decades, and I read something that Marguerite Duras had written about that book, and just from reading Duras writing about that book, I had this urge, this need to translate it, and couldn't find it for many months, could not get my hands on it, and then finally got it, and was just sort of, when I read it, my feeling was confirmed. So sometimes it's like a mystical thing, and sometimes it's a publisher asks me to do something and I say yes. And in terms of who I translate for, the answer to that question has changed a lot over the last 10 years since I started translating. I think I used to be really interested in translating for readers, as one should be concerned with, like things that I think people would really benefit from reading in English, things that don't already exist in English that people should have access to. Sphinx was a novel written without gender markers for the two main characters, so it was a quote-unquote genderless love story. And we didn't have something like that in the same way that Marguerite had written it. And I thought that was special and that people should be able to read that. And now I think I translate more for myself. I think I translate books that I believe other people will benefit from reading, but ultimately I am drawn more to projects now that I'm not translating quite as much and it's not my entire livelihood. I have the ability to kind of focus on books that when I read them I feel like I am going to really grow from having translated them, or I'm going to learn something about myself for having translated them, and that feels really special to me. And I think often we frame translation as a selfless act, but I like that it can actually be a very self-full, not selfish, but a self-full act.
Yeah. Wait, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
How do you decide who
Oh, right.
who to translate?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with this book, it sort of fell into my lap. I happened to know Allison, and she'd been in talks about this book for a while with an editor. It was a little bit outside of her comfort zone because it's a novel that was actually written in the 1920s. The Japanese is a little older, but I worked on writing from this period in my PhD, so it was like a good collaboration, and I had a lot of fun doing it. I've pitched a few books like since this, and I guess one of the books is like it's an author that I really loved already, and had already been translated into English a few times. But it was a novel of hers from her later period that hadn't been translated yet, and the subject matter was, I guess, personal, close to my heart. It's a novel that follows the story of several mixed-race orphans who were born in World War II, or after World War II in Japan, and yeah, I just never really seen anything like that in print, actually, either in Japanese or in English, yeah, the style in which it was written was just really striking, and I was just really compelled by it. I guess, yeah, like how I do strive to kind of pick things that I feel like aren't being represented yet in Japanese literature and translation. I feel like we're getting past the Murakami like boom, which is great, but there does tend to be this kind of, I guess, market, for better or worse, of like sort of like magical realism, sort of like weird isolated characters who wander around with cats and stuff like that. Like Americans really seem to love that, and it sells. But I also really like want to translate books that like are more realistic and show like the actual kind of like social realities that are going on for younger people in Japan. You know, there's been a recession there for a long time, and a lot of young folks are like really struggling to get by, and so like books that, you know, talk about class realities for younger women in some way. Also, like, I'm really interested in trying to translate books from Okinawa, which is like a region that I think a lot of American people don't think about, even though we should, because there's a big American military base there. So I guess like these are the kinds of stories that I feel compelled to try and bring in English, because I think people should think about them and read them. And as for who I translate for, yeah, it's a good question. I guess like I'm ultimately guided by my own taste, but yeah, I think I translate for like people like me, maybe, who kind of like maybe aren't monolingual necessarily, but grew up with a foot in like multiple cultures, and yeah, someone who's maybe like not a typical American reader, but I feel like, you know, I can take a chance on. So yeah, I guess that's all I'll say for now.
Those are all such great points, and I think it's interesting. I guess we all sort of write for, you know, the reader who's not the typical American reader. Since the typical American reader is not reading literature and translations, you are all atypical special readers. I, you know, have worked exclusively on commission, but that is in part because I spent so long translating Bolaño, and then I also have stuck with a few other writers, so you know, haven't had a lot of time. But I have been, you know, I have turned down some things and, you know, preferred others, and it's interesting. I mean, I think that one of the things that draws me to a book, and I noticed that a lot of the books I've translated in the last 10 years have fit this description, is books that sort of have one foot in nonfiction and one foot in fiction, and that are essayistic in some way. And I guess I'm just really excited by books that are on some level ideas based, and that have some sort of intellectual, some component of intellectual inquiry. Yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
I have a question about research, which is something I think is in doing translation, I feel like there's an infinite amount of knowledge and research that can be thought of as helpful to a translation, and I wonder if like at what point, or like are there certain things that you feel like you make sure that you have a grasp on through the course of working on a project? Is there like a time when you feel like, okay, you've done enough? How do you figure that out?
I'm sorry, what was the end of the question?
How do you decide, like, this much research I've like learned enough about, I don't know, the culture, the history, or the authors, you know?
Well, I guess you're always a little bit overwhelmed by all the research you can't do. And I mean, some of the research you do is very specific, you know, looking up references, and that you have to do, and you do. But, you know, where do you start? First of all, you want to read everything written by the writer before, you know, all the rest of the books by the writer, and even that sometimes doesn't get done. And then, you know, you want to read the works of their generation, then you want to read, you know, I'm just translating now a new project by a Cuban writer. It's the first time I've translated a Cuban writer since the very beginning. And I really don't know as much as I should about Cuban literature, so I'm just kind of at least reading around in it a little bit, and you know, and that's one of the great things about being a translator, is that you become a specialist in a sort of brief and fleeting kind of way in whatever writer you're translating at the time, and in the period and the milieu. So, but no, the answer is that you can never really do enough research.
Yeah, I guess I'll say, like, depends on what the deadline is. Sometimes I just can't, you know, and I actually like sort of starting out a book without doing that much research, just kind of looking at what's there and kind of, and actually not even reading the whole book through first, but like, translating as I read it, basically, so that my impressions are fresh. But yeah, for some pieces I have, I have an academic background, and so I do actually like to read academic pieces about a particular author if that's available. It just gives me more context and saves me time from having to do the same thing. Sometimes I'll get an idea from, something someone has written about the author, a thematic element of their work that I hadn't noticed and that I kind of want to bring out when I translate. But ultimately, like, it's kind of like me and the page, right? It's like my own sensibility. And I guess, like, with Kappa in particular, one thing we had to really think about was, like, how is this retranslation going to distinguish itself from the previous ones? How do we kind of try to create a type of English or a type of language that feels believable for being said in the 1920s, I guess, but also feels playful enough to be true to Akutagawa's style and to feel relevant to the reader today. I guess doing so much research can also bog you down and make you feel like you have to be overly faithful to the context, when, especially with a retranslation, part of the fun is departing from that too.
Yeah, I think I would echo what both of you said. It totally depends on the book. It depends on my life circumstances. In an ideal world, I could do with every translation project what I did with Ahmed Bonani's work, which was that I had a Fulbright and I went to Morocco for a year, and I lived in part with his daughter, and she took me to see all his country house, and I was literally touching he was dead. I was touching his manuscripts, and in his house where he had written everything, and never again am I gonna probably have the kind of circumstances in my life that would allow me to spend a year doing immersive research in an author's work. And even that, I left Morocco feeling like I still had so many questions, and then in the real world, ultimately, right now I'm working on 2 books by a Lebanese writer, and I would love to go to Lebanon and do some more research there. I have a full-time job. Am I going to actually be able to do that? Probably not. So, it sort of just comes down to the practicalities of life, and well, no matter how good circumstances are, I think it's both enough because you do it and you are the person doing it and you do it to the best of your ability, so it is enough, and also it's not enough because you, in your own knowledge, know that there could be maybe a little bit more that you were doing. So yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. Someone once asked me if I traveled to the place that each of my translations was set while I was translating it, and I thought that would be a nice thing. That someone did.
How would any of you characterize, this is kind of based off what you're saying about kind of being in the physical space of the writer you're translating, but like how would you characterize the relationship that you develop with the writer kind of through the process of translation? I mean, I'm assuming it just, you kind of like feel like you're in their heads and like kind of like that their language becomes your languages become kind of intermingled. I wonder if, I don't know, anyone might.
Well, it just so happens that like the first few books I've been working on, the authors are dead. So I can't ask them questions, and yeah, I can only kind of read around them for context. I don't know, with Akutagawa, like he's so famous, and he's like everything he's ever written has pretty much already been translated into English. But yeah, like I guess spending a lot of time with his language, I just came to enjoy like the unevenness of it, the kind of almost like jerky mechanical quality of his writing, and the humor of it. This is actually the last book that he wrote before he died by suicide in 1928, I think. And there's a chapter in the book where he like basically references his own suicide, but like makes it like really funny. And I was just kind of like blown away by like the perspective he had on that. Yeah, with other works, there's one author whose work I'm working on right now. She is alive. I haven't met her or talked to her, but as I've spent every single day translating her work for the past like 6 months or so, I start to notice little tics about her writing. I'm like, okay, that detail has come up 3 times now. It's probably should be edited. Like start to get annoyed, sometimes. I guess it's just kind of like, I don't know, it's like having a relationship with someone. You're just with them every day, and for better or for worse. Like it's like, yeah. Sometimes there's a great detail, and sometimes I'm just like, but yeah, I guess that's all.
Well, I've always resisted the idea that I'm channeling the author's voice in some way, just because, I don't know, it just seems sentimental or not true to my experience of it. Maybe I just have a more pragmatic approach to it. But of course you do feel very close to them on the page. Maybe punctuation is kind of a way that you feel close. There's sort of a certain signature in punctuation in a way. The way the sentences pause, the pauses in sentences, and the way sentences break. And I do pay a lot of attention to cadence, so that's one way. And relationships with real living writers, it depends so much. Some writers are less interested or less able to be involved in the translation process. I've had a really great translator-writer relationship with Alvaro Enrique, who is a Mexican writer, and he lives in New York, and his English is very good. And he also really enjoys the back and forth of the translation process, and he's really funny, and he just, can't stop himself from writing these long, hilarious notes in the margins and emails, and so that has been really, really a great collaboration.
Yeah, it really depends. I've translated a lot of dead writers who I've developed relationships with their children, or I've had no relationship at all around their work except just me and the text. I've had I've translated living writers with whom I had no contact whatsoever, and then living writers with whom I had a great deal of contact. I've translated 3 books by Anne Garetta, and she speaks very good English, and she was very involved in some of the editing process of the 2 most recent books I did of hers. Lots of, long Zoom calls and things like that. And then I also, I've translated a couple things by Abdullah Taya, and I would say of all the authors I've translated, I'm the closest with him, and yet we actually have had 0 conversations ever about my translations of his work. He's very hands-off. He trusts me. He doesn't want to read it. Or maybe he does read them and just doesn't say anything. I don't know. But we like see each other a lot and hang out as friends, and yet we never talk about my translations. That's kind of really lovely.
Going back to Natasha, you were saying, or Lisa also, about kind of the translating not for the typical American reader, and how the typical American reader is not reading translation. I guess in some ways, in my little bubble, I'm like, oh, I hear quite often people saying, oh, I love reading translated literature. And my question to that is kind of like, why? Like, how is reading a work in translation different? If we're agreeing that we're to read it as a work of literature in its own right, how is it different to read something that's been translated? And I was reading something written by the translator and scholar Chantal Wright, who writes about how a work of translation is requires a special kind of reading. It's like a hybrid text that has dual authorship and multiple cultures involved, and that there are like traces in the translated text that kind of point back to the original language and also to the translator. And I'm curious to hear, as like from the translator's point of view, what do you think is like, how do we read a translation as a translation?
Well, it's a question that I've thought about a lot, and that I find is kind of fraught. I guess on some level I do hope that people will read the books that I translate and not be distracted by the thought that there is some other text behind it. But on the other hand, I've read a lot of interesting theory talking about why it's good for readers to be aware of that. Can readers tell that it's a translation if they don't know? I do an interesting experiment with one of my translation workshops, and I choose passages or a couple of sentences from 6 different novels, some of them originally English, some of them originally Spanish, to see if they can tell which ones are translations. My students usually cannot, but a friend of mine who's a really sharp reviewer, I decided to test her, and she was like, oh yes, bah, 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 bah. She could tell, she knew everyone immediately. So I found that a little deflating. Another interesting little observation is that I was on a panel with with a novelist, Kiri Kitamura, and she was saying something really interesting, which is that in her most recent book, she tried to write it in the style of a novel in translation. And basically what that meant was that she used lots of comma splices. So, is there, I don't know. I don't think that what you want to be, whatever. I hope that the comma splice is not what readers take away as the foreign element of the books that I'm translating. But I don't know, maybe that's.
Yeah, wow, that's so interesting. I didn't know that about her book. Because I read Intimacies, and her style was like so striking in that book, and I thought about it a lot. But the fact that she wrote it like a translation was really fascinating.
I don't know if it's a tribute or it's
No, I think the book is like about translation in a way, so that's really interesting. Yeah, well, like, I feel like a lot of times publishers don't want people to know that it's a translation, so they don't put our names on the covers, and they try everything to make it look like a normal book. So yeah, I don't know. I guess like going back to like who we translate for, I guess like in my mind I always like picture a reader who can read Japanese actually, and so like, yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm thinking about like, you know, how one might read the text side by side, the enjoyment of that, and you know, yeah, I don't know exactly if I have a really good answer for like how to read translations, but I know that like something that used to bother me about translated text from Japanese, at least like, I don't know, 15 years ago, I think it's changed a lot now, is that like the dialogue was just written really badly, and felt really stilted. And so I always like, yeah, try to like think a lot about dialogue, I guess, and how people might read dialogue when they read a translation.
This is a really great and also really difficult question, because I think as a translator, I love when there's a review of one of my translations that's very much grappling with what I have done with the book. Whether or not it's a compliment or like a nice review or not, I think it's nice to be engaged with on that level, and for someone to be able to understand the text behind the one that they're reading. But also I think it's really great if somebody reads the book and doesn't have that kind of interaction with it and just reads it. And I used to own a bookstore, and it's an unfortunate reality that I think a lot of people are scared at the idea of reading in translation, and there's this sort of suspicion behind the act of reading in translation as though it's not the real text, and they're somehow, they've lost something, or they're being tricked in some way, and it's just true. I mean, that's the vast majority of people in America aren't seeking out translations. And so often if someone came into my bookstore and asked for a romance or a mystery, I would give them something in translation without saying it was in translation, and they would come back and say they really liked it, and they had no interaction with the fact that it was in translation. And I think that's also really great. I don't think books in translation need to sort of be separated off into their own category. I think when someone asked for a romance, I gave them Duras. And I think it's actually, in our bookstore, we made a point of not having a translated literature category, because translated literature is literature. And so I think it can be wonderful to have a reader who is responding to it as a translation, and I think it's equally wonderful to have a reader who has no idea it's a translation.
Okay, I have been signaled that we need to turn to the audience for questions. So audience, please announce your questions. Dale.
I love this discussion. I had like 20,000 different questions that have come up, and I'm probably going to ask the least interesting one. That I think this kind of last question maybe segues into it a little bit. I teach Ovid's Metamorphoses, and I usually teach the Horace Gregory translation, but I always invite students to bring in other translations so we can compare and see how different they are. I wonder, as you're grappling with that text, and I think, when you look at those translations, there's a lot of artistry in each one of them. They're also beautiful. They're different renditions. I think I've read 3 different versions of Metamorphoses and really loved it. But I wonder where it is that the artist in you butts up against the artist that you're translating, especially when you're dealing with things like idioms and things like that are just not going to go for a literal translation. How do you negotiate that when you're working on a novel that's obviously beautifully written, but that you also have stake in because you're rendering the entire book in another language, and it's your words that people will be reading?
Well, this is maybe an unsatisfied satisfying answer to your question, but I think that Ovid's Metamorphoses in different translations is very different from the kind of text that we're translating. Just because the convention in translating the classics is, the translator is putting their own stamp on it intentionally, and the whole point of retranslating it is to, bring their own artistic perspective to it. Yeah, retranslations in general, I think that is the case. And if you read a review of a retranslation, often the review is all about the translation, it's not about the book. So I think probably, I don't know if you've done retranslations, I have not. So I feel like I can't quite speak to that. And yeah, I don't know. I don't think that I feel that or at least I haven't consciously thought about how I'm, putting my stamp on a book so much. But maybe someone else has a different experience.
To clarify, when you asked butts up against the artistry of the original, do you mean because there's something that doesn't readily translate into English that you have to kind of rework, or do you just mean in general?
I'm so hopeless when it comes to foreign languages that I think that's what I mean. But yes, when the words on the page in the original language are not going to come out as it were in the order, it's not like a one-for-one translation. You have to do something with the idiom or something with grammatical constructions. And like just based on my own experience of these various retranslations of the classics, and your context I think was very well put. You can be very close, or you can get very far sometimes, and sometimes you have to. And I'm just curious how you negotiate those things.
Yeah, I think it always happens in every translation that things are different. It's different. The fear that a translation is different confirmed. But I think in an ideal world, you are not changing the voice or the spirit of the text. I think sometimes a translation specifically calls for that. I translated this book called In Concrete by Marguerite, which literally every paragraph has some kind of aggressive play on words or some innuendo that I have to change in English for the book to stay the way it actually, the more I changed it, the more it was like the original. Because if the point is to make plays on words and to be funny and to make the reader laugh, if I'm just translating the words and they're not actually innuendos or puns anymore in English, then that's not the same text anymore. So it was a sort of paradox where the looser I was and the more ways I found to exploit English and the way English could be flipped on its head, the more the author was happy with the translation.
Yeah, I think it also has to do a lot with reader expectations, which change over time. If you look at older translations from Japanese, from the 50s or before, I feel like they were very aggressively domesticated. It's domestication is making it sound as close to normal English as possible, and foreignization is preserving some of the weird, letting the English sound a little weird, I guess. I feel like there was an overemphasis on domestication to kind of because the expectations that the reader in America knows nothing about this place, and to try to make it as relatable as possible. And yeah, I think now that's much less the case, and there's more room for foreignization, and there's more room to translate things as they are, because readers are more familiar with a lot of elements of Japanese culture than they were 50 years ago. And yeah, so that's just something I thought of.
Yes, question back there.
So I know that back in the day, some translators would really just go for it and say I could sort of do better. Are you ever tempted to just go for it and change something where well, this is sort of a crappy ending,
No.
I think that was in the 17th century. No, but I will say, and this is sort of a continuation of the last conversation, is that in some ways I feel that my entire career as a translator has been about convincing myself that I can take liberties, and that the more liberties I take, the better it will be. And, you know, sort of what Emma was saying essentially. And it's just amazing how many times you have to remind yourself of that. You know, you think that you finally learned that lesson, and then I find that I learn this from my students. I'll always have a student who's doing something really bold, and I'll think, wow, look what the student did. You know, we can do this. But it's also about, you know, it's like you're you know, shrugging around inside the sort of tight sweater, and then it keeps getting a little bit looser and looser, but you're still inside the sweater. So.
I haven't rewritten things, but I know that it sometimes does happen that editorial decisions are made about books to cut certain sections. Maybe not rewrite, but definitely cut certain sections that, you know, they feel for whatever reason, like, won't be well received by an American reader, or might not make sense, or just don't add anything to the text in English. That definitely happens, and I've seen it happen.
Yeah, I think the only changes to a text I've ever made were in service of keeping it the same, like I was talking about. And there was one, I had a fun opportunity. I was translating this book called Revenge of the Translator, in which it's framed as though it's a translation from English to French, and at the end there's an epilogue, and the translator says, my translation was so different than the original that the publisher has decided to publish it as its own book, which is now going to be translated into English by an American translator, and then the name of the translator is given, and I had to put my own name there because it's my name on the cover of the American translation of this French book, and the author agreed, and so I got to put my name in the book. But that was because otherwise, if it just said it's about to be translated by Mike Kirkfeld, but then it's my name on the cover of the book, it doesn't make any sense. And so I think changes happen to make the book still work once it's been brought over into translation, but never would I dare make an actual change, just because I felt like it.
This is a question related to Emma's comment about bookstores, your bookstore not having like a separate translation section. You all brought up texts from non-European authors, and I've noticed that most publishing companies will have this habit of comparing non-Western texts with Western texts, or with another text from a similar culture, and doing very superficial comparison. So I was curious as to what the three of you have to say about comparison in relation to translation. Is there a way to avoid comparison, or do you think it's not really a problem? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the publisher has definitely done it for this one. It's compared to Alice in Wonderland. So I don't know. I guess I don't really make those decisions. I don't get to decide the cover, although I think this is a pretty great cover. I don't really get to write the blurb. All these things that kind of the publisher thinks, you know, is necessary to sell the book. And yeah, like you're saying, like those things called comps, or basically a book is compared to another one, is a really important like marketing tool that I don't really get a say in. And I agree that it's problematic. I don't think this one is like too egregious, but yeah, it does bother me when it happens. Unfortunately, I feel like I just don't get much of a say in it. But yeah.
I think maybe also problematic in a different way is the comparison of any text from a North African country to any other translation that came out from an African country, or like kind of lumping them together, because I think what I've faced often, when I was pitching this book by a Lebanese writer, I would hear things like, this is so great, but we already have a book coming out from Iran next year. And it's like, okay, are they anything alike? They're not even the same. Like, what are you talking about? And so I think that kind of thing happens a lot, where a publisher will say, well, we're already doing a book by this other North African writer, and therefore we can't do another one, as if that makes any sense at all. So this kind of lumping together of, look, Moroccan literature, or North African literature, or African literature, that kind of comparison, I think, is really insidious.
Do we have time for one more question?
One last question.
One last question?
Because you have all translated such famous authors, like Ryunosuke
Could you speak a little louder? Sorry.
Sure.
Thanks.
Because you've translated such famous authors like Bolaño, Akutagawa, and Duras, do you guys feel like you faced any additional pressures or burdens because they were such authors of such high reputability when translating the work?
Well, this is my first translation, but yes, it was weird to translate such a famous author for my first book. I think because he's so canonical as an author, and I know it's probably the kind of thing that is going to be taught in classes and stuff like that. I think I was extra nervous about just making sure there weren't any mistakes. I didn't read the other translations too closely, but I did kind of look through at the end to see okay, what are some different choices that were made? Do my choices make sense against theirs? Just because I just feel like it's the kind of thing that's going to be scrutinized by someone somewhere in the academy, and I was very scared. But yeah, maybe I'm just being paranoid. I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. When I started translating Bolaño, I guess I didn't realize how big Bolaño was or would be. I owe my career as a translator to Bolaño, really. So it's a little hard to reflect on it from the outside. You sort of, especially because Bolaño had died just before I started translating him. I remember when the book started coming out, there was this question in my mind about how much of a representative of Bolaño I had to be, which I could be. And I couldn't really, I couldn't really be, a representative other than as his translator. So, but it is an interesting relationship that you have with the writer, and especially when the writer is, very well known.
I think with Duras, I benefited from the fact that over the many decades, she's had various translators from various time periods, and so there's not one unified Duras voice, where I think if there were only, maybe if a few books by her that had come out recently, I would feel this pressure to kind of match the voice, but I didn't have to kind of adhere to that, so that was very nice.
Okay, I guess that's all we have time for. I feel like I could listen to conversation about translation forever. But if we can give another round of applause for our translator.
Thank you so much to our panelists. It was so wonderful. It was such a deep and rich conversation I think we had, and also wonderful readings from all three of you. Thank you so much, Bonnie, for actually leading that talk. Great questions. So many different bases of translation. I believe we do have some wine outside, so please avail yourself of it, and stay around and talk to one another and talk to our panelists about literature and translation. Thank you so much for coming out.
Just before we break up, I'm speaking on behalf of Form 1 Kent, this building. So I really encourage you to sign up to the mailing list out there, because we have lots of good stuff coming up. We're very happy to do this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Come to David, about Form 1 Kent. The music that we actually performed here.
Yeah.
Thank you.